You're listening to Distraction Therapy with Rob Watson. Conversations about how we find meaning in our lives and what it's like to be part of a meta-modern world. Hello, Rob Watson here with another Distraction Therapy, and today I'm with about an hour of Distraction Therapy, and I'm joined again by Ryan Clayton. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you.
And it seems to be a lovely sunny day here today.
It is, even inside, it's very warm in here.
Yeah, once again, we're in a coffee shop in Leicester, so you kind of maybe pick up on the noises in the background and whatever's going on. But it seems very quiet today. There's not many people about.
Yeah, well, bank holiday, everybody's left, haven't they? They've all decided to leave the toilet and go somewhere nice instead.
Disappeared, get out of the city, and they're all flying off to the... I don't know, where do people fly off to these days?
Skegness, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, just a brief interlude from the joys of the city. So, how's things? What have you been up to? What have you been watching and reading this week, or the last couple of weeks?
To be honest, not much that's been new. I'm still working through a book about superheroes and kind of mapping their development onto our culture and history, and how that's kind of affected popular culture, which has been very interesting. Comic books here and there. I've been talking about Heidegger a lot there's a guy I work with who, unbeknownst to me, has been reading his way through Being in Time, so that's been a nice change of pace to just talk about, death whilst you're sitting there in the office space.
Well, yeah, it's kind of probably the most apt place to talk about it, isn't it?
Yeah.
As you editing your press releases and your profile updates.
Yeah, it's not something you expect to find in the wild, really, is it? Someone's like, "Oh, who's your favourite philosopher?" Heidegger. Oh, that's great. I'm actually reading Being in Time right now. It's like, what's going on? What kind of alternate reality have I stepped into where that's a normal thing that people in an office do?
I suppose it's better than, I don't know, Jeremy Clarkson's memoirs or...
Well, yeah, there is that. I remember asking him what he was reading one week, and he said, I'm working my way through Proust's In Search of Lost Time. And I was like, oh, okay.
It's quite ambitious.
Yeah, I don't know how to talk to you anymore. You might be too smart for me, actually.
Well, I think I actually bought that, it's 9 volumes, is it?
I think so. 7 or 9.
7 or 9, and I've actually got it, and it's like there for my retirement, because I've started it, and I got about the first third of the way through the first third of the first book, and it's like kind of okay, why am I reading this? But it is, it's one of those things that you kind of it's more like it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Well, yeah, exactly.
I seem to pick up books which are just so obtuse and obscure that you're sitting there kind of trying to decode it, whereas having and I've forgotten the pleasure of just picking up a trash novel and just whizzing through it in an afternoon or something.
Yeah, but you spend a lot of times, to be fair, as well, in like second-hand bookshops and stuff, so you're bound to find weird little things. I mean, I still feel like I'm working my way through the canon of what's considered good, and still trying to wrap my head around that.
Yeah, I think sometimes you got to rely on the kind of random generator that you see something on the bargain shelf in the you go to the charity shop and there's something in the bin and you go, oh right, I don't normally see them. I mean, I did pick up a couple of Philip K. Dick novels recently at the little library on Foss Road, and that was that stuff I've read before. And you never see them in second-hand shops. They're always, they're not, you go in and there's a load of Lee Child novels there, or lots of other authors whose names escape me when I try and remember a name, but it's...
lots of used copies of 50 Shades of Grey and all of that.
Yeah, all the ones that were popular at one time. But the Philip K. Dick ones, there's you can get, I don't know what the resale market's like on eBay and the book repositories and things like that, but you never see them in the charity shops. It's like you never see the certain bands that you never see on the shelves, CDs wise.
Well, I suppose him in particular, he's one of those authors that's actually really quite good and never really goes out of fashion. So once you pick up a book and you read it, the people who do tend to keep them. so they never end up like disused, or you find a lot of copies of Nausea, which I find quite funny, by Sartre, because it tends to be one of those books people pick up thinking, oh, that'll be really interesting, and then the way that it's written is so dry and dull and monotonous that I imagine people get like 30 pages in and go, you know what, my life's too short for this, forget it.
Yeah. So for entertainment, I've been watching the Bond movies because I've got Amazon Prime.
Oh.
So they've all appeared on that now, and so when I say all the Bond movies, not mainly the Daniel Craig ones. So.
Well, this is a conversation we could have for at least 2 hours, because I grew up watching all of the James Bond films. Huge fan of Ian Fleming's novels, and I just think they're fantastic.
Well, I was going to say that the novels aren't necessarily so central these days, but the films are. And the difference between the novel and the film, obviously, is kind of the films run off and create a whole world and of their own.
Well, I think it's because the novels are so different to the films, especially like that kind of from about Roger Moore onwards, and when the films start to what's the word I'm looking for? Adapt a slightly more fantastical approach with all of the strange gadgets
and the gags.
The tone diverges quite a lot from that of the novels, and also there's a lot in the novels that I think people would rather you forget was in there, like the kind of racism and misogyny of the time that is almost baked in to the novels in a degree that you can't take them out. Like Live and Let Die is one that comes to mind, where because it takes place in, I think it's Harlem in America, there's just so much of that novel that's really difficult to read, and it's a shame, because if it weren't for that, it would be a fantastic novel, and it is in a lot of respects a fantastic novel, but it is a bit hard sometimes to go back and read them. Yeah,
that kind of the expectation of some kind of revisionism to make things suit it's like editing films for references that were common held at the time, but which now have passed, and I understand the argument that says that they should be re-edited or reversioned to suit modern expectations or contemporary expectations. But at the same time, it is what it is, and if you start to reconstruct your culture or a culture on the basis of retrofitting everything to your current expectations, that's no worse than the Soviets did. It becomes that's what the totalitarians had done in the past. So popular culture is just it is what it is. It has its strengths and it has its weaknesses.
I always feel a bit uncomfortable with the sanitization of past popular culture, because it's so easy to do with films, isn't it? You can just splice out a couple of seconds here and there, and before you know it, it's squeaky clean. But I think there's something to be said for keeping these things around, but almost with like a bit of a disclaimer to show that that was what the world was like. People were saying horrible things about people because they were at a stage where the world hadn't developed enough and people weren't educated enough. And I think it's important to grow and use that as a basis for growth, because once you get rid of it, it feels like a backslide is a lot easier.
I think if you're the kind of person who thinks that, Dad's Army, some others do have them, kind of Mike Yarwood, Benny Hill with the apotheosis of British culture in the 1970s, then you're a kind of sad git. I remember reading Nick Timothy's book, he was worked with Theresa May, one of her advisors, and in his book that's the kind of stuff that he said, this is what defines us as the British nation or popular culture. But it was all that kind of stuff, and it was like, you've got a very limited worldview. That's what you expect. And it's there's other stuff out there, and there's lots of stuff that at the same time challenged that. It's really interesting. I went to see, I've spoken to you since we saw Fantastic Beasts, The Secrets of Dumbledore.
No, I'm amazed anybody went to see it.
I think it's a really good film, and I'm tempted to go and see it again. It's much more. I didn't regard it as a children's film. So it didn't have that kind. It's quite dark, and there's a sequence in it which I thought was just amazing, and both in terms of the production design and the type of storytelling that J.K. Rowling is trying to, and with the director, what's the director's called? What they're trying to bring about, and they're in Berlin in the 1930s, and there's the kind of the wizards ministry in Berlin, and they go into this room where there's this kind of public event, a meeting taking place, and it's got these huge, absolutely massive, a kind of 30-foot high oil paintings of these kind of Germanic themes on the walls, and it's just you sit there and go, this is a different level of storytelling, this, in terms of using a popular idiom of fantasy and stuff like that. It's pointing people in a direction for something which deals with themes in a very mature way, which are very much less, the Marvel stuff doesn't quite have it has an emotional depth, I think, and it has a symbolic depth to it, which you don't really get. So no wonder it's kind of left people feeling a bit, hang on a minute, this isn't such a fun thing.
Yeah.
Where's all the kids running around pretending that they can be wizards and casting spells? It's like, no, this is really adult. This is a really mature take, and a really what's the word I'm looking for? Prescient. It's an important moment in popular culture to say it reflects what's going on in the world, but expressed through a mode of fantasy, which I don't think you get very easily with things like the Marvel and the Star Wars and the other kind of fantasy genres.
No, well, those things are designed as like, very light popcorn entertainment. You walk in and you watch the film, and then you walk out, and nothing's changed for you. It doesn't challenge you in any way, but it's just a good fun time. And I mean, I've not seen the Fantastic Beast film. I've not seen any of them, to be honest.
I'd recommend whether you catch up on them on DVD or whatever when they're out. But I'd absolutely recommend seeing it, because it just, I'm not saying it's a great film, but it's a film. I thought, what's the other word I use for it? It's a film to be admired. It's a proper piece of filmmaking where it's actually trying to tell a story, and you can see that it's trying to do something which is much more profound than just knockabout and slapstick. And hey, look at how good we are at doing our special effects. It's kind of the special effects are grounded, and the fantasy is grounded in the story, not the other way around, which is what, and that's why I think it's problematic for people.
It's a bit of a bitter pill to swallow at the moment, even if it is a good film, because, J.K. Rowling's gotten into all sorts of trouble for things that she said, and various, like, transphobic comments and stuff. And I imagine that might be one of the reasons that she's been sort of, for a few people at least, her image has been a bit soured in popular culture, and it's a bit hard, perhaps, for people to separate that from the film.
Well, yeah, and there's people can't separate their own emotion from from what people actually say, and two, so there's a lot of projection onto JK figures like J.K. Rowling, like Ian Fleming. There's an awful lot of people have their own view, which they can never live up to, and people have the mythologizing of them, and it's part of the money-making machine. Yeah, that she, for whoever they are, people then at some point draw a line and say, no, this is the limit to which I am going to be flexible to the audience or to my fans, and you have to make your choice. It's either this or no engagement. And it's like, kind of, we have this idea of expecting our idols to be, constantly adaptable to suit us, not the other way around. And that's the interesting dynamic that goes on with this, is our expectations of people who we idolize as creative geniuses.
Well, because it's interesting the way you said it. That's how the machine works, because there is a certain point at which you're making something in your room, and then it takes off, and then before you know it, you've become a brand that's part of a machine that's designed to sell these things, and you're no longer allowed to be human. to the point where you're no longer allowed to make mistakes, and anything that you say you can't get away with in the same sense because people are criticizing it, and they're so much more aware of what it is that you're saying all the time.
How in terms of comic books, then, that, the name, Stan Lee obviously comes to mind in terms of somebody who's this. Who are the other iconic figures in that oeuvre?
Well, Stan Lee himself is quite interesting a figure, because he was very much like the marketeer, like the I don't want to say snake oil salesman, because that makes it sound like the stuff that he was selling was
Steve Jobs.
Yeah, that makes it sound like what he was selling was
the Bill Gates or the Steve
crap.
Jobs.
Yeah, but no, he was very good at marketing, and he was very much clued into that kind of business mindset and knew how to sell things to the audience that he was selling them to, which is one of the reasons why it took off so well, and his brand built up to the point where he's now sort of posthumously seen as this genius who, quill in hand, created an entire universe of characters, which is so far from the truth anyway, because it's such a massively collaborative effort that throughout pieces are still being added to that tapestry that keeps it growing. And Stan Lee, when you look back historically at his input, is actually a lot smaller than people would have you believe, and he did a lot when the Marvel Universe was growing of stealing credit from people and shining a light on himself and ignoring the other creative minds that helped add and arguably did a lot more than he did, to people like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, who created, the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, Spider-Man, all of the real characters, and gave them life. And he just sort of went, well, no, they're my characters now, when really he wrote sort of a paragraph and then gave that paragraph to the artist, and the artist created a comic book, and then he filled in the word balloons. But in terms of other figures, it's hard. I suppose Siegel and Schuster, who created Superman in 1938, that was a massive achievement that sort of changed the face of popular culture forever. It's really hard to I don't think you can overstate the influence that had. People like Bill Finger and Bob Kane, when they created Batman. I don't know in terms of
how much of that is retrospective, and how much of that at the time were people given this kind of, what we're seeing with somebody like J.K. Rowling is there's a kind of an unfolding of a creative process. You don't know what the next iteration of the story is going to be, and so we have very different views. Afterwards, we can look at somebody's work and say, this had some kind of a thread that went through it, and it had some kind of a logic to it. But as we're living through it, it's less predictable and less understandable.
I think a lot of it is sort of a unique combination of both. Like, for the example of the creation of Superman, at the time, that would have been something that struck popular culture like a lightning bolt, because everybody saw it. They were so readily available back then that everyone was reading them. And it would have been something that had an immediate effect. With Stan Lee, it's probably a bit more retrospective, because when you go back and you look at all of those early Marvel comic books, and they're all sort of coming out at roughly similar times, it's very much a sort of, like you say, an unfolding. These things, they appear in like a very rough, almost poorly defined sense, and then as they move forward, they become more defined, and they start to cement themselves a little better in popular culture. I think there is a lot of revisionism that goes on, but maybe not too much, if you see what I mean. It's hard because there's a balance there.
And I suppose it depends on the nature of the work that somebody's doing, which is, think of it in terms of film directors. So somebody like Ridley Scott hasn't had, or Steven Spielberg. They're on pedestals. They're iconic figures who can their name is attached to something that opens doors and gets films made.
Yeah.
Whereas there's other directors who've kind of and more recently somebody like Terry Gilliam comes to mind in terms of, despite the name, always finds it problematic and difficult to get projects completed.
Yeah, well, I think there is a bit of a difference there as well. Like with people like Ridley Scott and Steven Spielberg, to my knowledge, most of their films when they first came out were massive successes, like pretty much overnight, like Jurassic Park. I don't know about Alien, actually, now that I think about
huge
Ridley
success
Scott.
at the time, but no expectation that it would have been at the time. So.
Well, yeah, but I mean, everybody's got to start somewhere, I suppose. But then when you look at directors like Terry Gilliam, I don't know to what level his films were a massive success when they first came out. Maybe critically, but when you look at something like Brazil, for instance, I mean, he had such a hard time getting
Blade
that
Runner
film
was
out.
a flop because it came out at the same time as E.T.
Yeah.
and nobody went to see it, and everybody went to see E.T. and it fitted, at that time. But now, which film is regarded as the enduring piece of
Blade
art?
Runner is an interesting film as well, because that film has gone through such a long process of revision and re-editing and making sure that it's, like when it first came out, it was almost a totally different film. They had the Harrison Ford monologue and bits were added there, and that the whole film was deemed to be quite boring, and a lot of it was explained to you as if you were an idiot. And then they found what became known as the director's cut. They found like a work print, I think, on the floor somewhere, and that then became like, oh, this film's actually quite good. And then Ridley Scott, when he realised that there was a demand for it, went back and edited it the way that he wanted to in the first place. So there is a sort of like retrospective, like, oh, this film has always been really good, but it's the studio system that got in the way of us all seeing it at the time.
Well, yeah, I mean, having saw it when it first came out, which ages me a lot. It was one of those films which, if you saw it, you would like it. But it was getting people. It was a very different way of getting people into the cinema. As I say, it came out the same week as E.T. did.
Yeah.
And it, the now the way that popular culture is driven and fantasy is driven, it kind of it set the framework for a whole. It was very influential. So, I always like the Velvet. The thing about the Velvet Underground or the Sex Pistols is that you say, well, how many people? There's 12 people in the audience, but each one. Brian Eno says this, but everybody who's in that audience went out and started a band.
Yeah,
it's hugely influential. And Blade Runner is one of those films where it's developed its mythos afterwards, but it lost money for the studio. Nearly bankrupts the studio in the process.
That's interesting. Then I had no idea that you saw it when it first came out. I obviously forget that you're a prehistoric being.
Well, I was quite young at the time, but yeah.
So do you remember then? Because presumably you've seen it since. Do you remember the changes being
The changes
made?
are quite minor. It's things like there's a couple of the insertion of a couple of scenes, a couple of a couple of images in scenes. It's not a huge transformation.
Yeah,
it's still largely the same film.
The thing that everybody talks about is always the voiceover, Harrison Ford's voiceover.
In my view, it doesn't make that much difference. I like the voiceover. It's got that, it's film noir. Film noir had voiceovers. So it wasn't so, it's like, what would Star Wars be like without the opening crawl?
Yeah.
It's one of those things, and it's kind of I don't like films that have title. I was watching one of these Bond films the other day, and it's like London, Macau, something like that. It's like I don't like films that do that. Drop it into the script, oh, it's raining here in London again, something like rather than having a sign that says. But some films have to do that, It's like that's just one of the ways, and I suppose it kind of just who is signposting is a difficult thing to get right in any kind of, whether it's a piece of writing, how much do you signal, whether it's a radio program, how much do you keep signaling to people what's coming up or where you are in the narrative, and you're thinking you're trying to produce something which is open and accessible because it is a popular format and it does have to make commercial sense. But at the same time, if you do too much of that, that's why one of the reasons why the Marvel films, I think, are changing but they're not great. They're not good films. I think June and Dennis Field. What's his name again?
Is it what
Villeneuve.
Denis Villeneuve or something?
Something like that. I must learn to pronounce names. He's a much more interesting director because he doesn't do that signposting. He does it through the storytelling process, but that takes more time. Whereas this kind of every 15 seconds there's a fight scene or there's something that miraculously drops in to keep it being pushed forward is not so.
Yeah, well, the Marvel films are interesting in and of themselves because I feel like they do signpost a lot of that stuff very obviously, but then also at the same time are becoming much more inaccessible to the casual viewer because, I mean, like, you think about the Spider-Man film that just came out or the Doctor Strange film that's about to come out. They're so interwoven into the mythology that's been built up in all of the other films that when you speak to people that haven't seen the films, there's a sort of element of dread going in to watch those films because
you don't know the references.
Yeah, and they've built that into the brand so heavily that it feels like, oh, well, I can't go and see this new film because I missed out on the last two Marvel films, even if they're not even remotely relevant.
I think the killer to good storytelling is the word franchise.
Oh yeah.
It's like kind of you're not creating a film, you're not telling a story, you're managing a franchise, and it's like, oh, okay, it's like it puts different considerations. Not to say that those considerations about commercial viability aren't important, but if it gets in the way of good storytelling, then it's kind of a problem. But then the question is, what do we mean by good storytelling? Is a good question to ask. And who are we looking to? I mean, it's actually a really good question. Something I've thought about. What are the kind of archetypal, symbolic concerns? Let's use that as open a phrase as I can at the moment, that are coming through our popular culture that are telling us about who and what we are and the time that we're in and where it might be possibly going. And who are the storytellers? Who are the people who are framing those concerns? And how and in what way are those concerns being expressed? So the argument about Superman, for example, is it was a reaction to the Cold War. And the suggestion was that it was about, imperialism or the American empire occupying this position of dominance and that kind of thing, and the same with Bond as a kind of reaction against fading imperialism, and now it's become this whole thing about uncertainty in the world rather than sure-footedness.
Well, it's interesting as well when you consider just the character on their own, because they're the character of James Bond and the character of Superman, as you move through history, sort of occupy different roles. Like when Superman first appeared in 1938, he was created by these sort of two Jewish outsiders and was very much a socialist superhero. Like super villains as we know them today didn't appear for quite a while, and he's just there beating up corrupt senators and making sure people are accountable to the people for the kind of evils that they've committed against them, which I think is really interesting and has sort of started to be returned back to a bit now that Superman sort of worked its way through to almost maturity. And James Bond as well is always interesting because he was a very establishment figure to begin with, and now in the movies, I think in every movie he goes rogue from the establishment to do what the establishment can't, and it's a weird kind of flip of the traditional role that James Bond used to fulfill in those original novels and in the original films as well.
Yeah, it's that Donald Rumsfeld thing. It's the known, it's the unknown unknowns, and James Bond is this figure, as you say, can go rogue to look in the places that we're not even aware that we should be looking, the shadows where we're not even aware that there's something there. And this is what it gets me in terms of, it's like these archetypal figures. This is very symbolic of something. It's a symbol that says they carry something about our ability to process and come to terms with our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
Which is that these figures, they carry a lot. The reason that they continue to be popular and so many and recognisable and endlessly repeated in various formats is because they are the bearers of a certain function symbolically within society, and it might be played out differently in different societies in different ways, but that's what it taps into, and it's because it resonates. And you can't put forward popular. You can't try and create something to be popular.
No.
You have to tap into something that is popular.
Yeah. To come back to the idea of filmmakers operating right now that are interesting, there's a guy whose films I've liked for quite a while called S. Craig Ziegler, who's sort of if you think Tarantino and his kind of very obviously postmodern works, his films are like if Tarantino was able to make a film sincerely, which I think is interesting because it's almost what we've talked about before, that kind of metamodern approach of bringing sincerity back into popular culture. So his films are still obsessed with history and B-movies and being relentlessly entertaining, but in a way that isn't, oh, look at me, look how clever I am, look at all of these references. It's more of a kind of taking the stylistic approaches of some of those films and what made them so entertaining and injecting quite a lot of heart back into them. Like I'd really recommend watching Brawl in Cell Block 99 and Dragged Across Concrete as his second and third movies as films that are very like entertaining in that kind of Tarantino way, that where they do occasionally indulge in like hyper-violence and those kind of like B-movie tropes of we're just going to make something that's really quite fun here, you know, the almost campy special effects, but tell it with a heart, with some heart, like the story of the main character in Brawl in Cell Block 99 is so heartfelt and told with such conviction that it feels in a totally different league from something like Tarantino's films, where all of the characters are so obviously written by a guy that wants you to know how clever he is.
It's interesting that I quite like the John Wick films, but I don't know why I like them, because there's not really any plot or story to them. It's just an ongoing series of action scenarios. But they do it in such a way that it's quite. It's almost like ballet in a way.
Yeah,
it's a dance. It's that level of. But this solitary figure at the centre. I suppose it's slightly different than the Man with No Name and the Sergio Leone, Clint Eastwood type films.
Yeah.
Whereas it's somebody who's this kind of stoic figure who endures through. I'm not necessarily saying adaptation. He doesn't seem to change. He just seems to progress through from.
He keeps finding somebody else to kill.
Yeah. Or other people keep trying to kill him, and it's this endless kind of trying to reassert the balance of being able to just be.
Yeah. I think that the thing about those films, because I love those films as well, I feel like it's hard to find somebody who's seen them and doesn't.
We're not into rom-coms, are we?
No.
Well, I do. Very male kind of forms of films we're talking about here.
It is actually, yeah. I'll admit I do enjoy a rom-com, but there's nothing quite like seeing Keanu Reeves kill somebody with a series of knives. No, they're so relentlessly well made, those John Wick films. They're very slick. They know what they are. They're very, like, there's very little fat on those movies. It never wastes any time. Even all of the world building that takes place, it takes place in a very minor capacity just so it can push the story forward and take John Wick to new places where he's allowed to brutalize somebody.
Do you think that's come from games? That
Perhaps.
Kind of the lack of. To some extent, it's a lack of allowing films to breathe and have an extemporation. Is that the right word?
No idea.
Those bits where you kind of just have dialogue almost for dialogue's sake, where there's like character development, if you like. Whereas this is a series of action points that are just linked, which is what gaming is.
Yeah,
You don't have periods of reflection and, oh no, I've just killed 13 people with my knives off from the back of a horse, galloping down the street in New York or something. You don't. Nobody sits there and says, was that not really odd and strange thing to do? It's like, no, just move on to the next level of the game.
Yeah, I know. I'd never thought about it from that perspective, but it could be, especially as video games become a much more popular form of entertainment. I mean, I still remember when I was a kid, and I guess all of those kids that grew up playing PlayStation are now at the point where they're still playing PlayStation.
But they're making the films.
They're also making all the films, yeah, and those kind of those interests that have carried on are now starting to inform the decisions made when making popular culture. Because I suppose that kind of an influence wasn't prevalent when films in the 70s were being made.
Well, it'd be different influences. Literary influences, other filmmaking influences. George Lucas being influenced by Japanese film directors or French New Wave cinema.
So a lot of French comic books as well.
Yeah, so the reference points are of that period. So the reference points for today are more likely to be electronic games as they are to be other movies or other or literature, because that will shape the characteristic of the narrative, I suppose.
Yeah.
But regardless of the form, the ideas are still resonant with past. It's this idea. I'm reading Schelling, German romantic philosopher who informed Coleridge, and it's transcendental philosophy, which I'm trying to get to grips with, which actually reads, it's very accessible, and it reads very much like a kind of model of pragmatism to me, which is trying to figure out recall what it says, but it's the there's a relationship between the form and the idea. So what he says is that if you change the form, the idea is changed, and if you change the idea, the form is changed. So there's a link between that intuition and projection. Is what he describes it as. So in terms of, there is a point to this, in terms of trying to link that to popular culture and seeing things like games and films, the form changes, but we still have these things which we keep going back to in those different medium. So in literature, as we move across transmedia forms, and we go from comic books and trash novels to heavy condensed forms of literature, to movies, to art house films, to art and exhibitions and music and games, there's actually, what you see across the spread of those things are themes that resonate on a collective level. There's like kind of something, you can't pick out from the individual piece of artifact the individual item, but what you can do is when you look at them collectively, you can say, actually, there's a pattern about these things, and they relate to each other in some kind of a way.
Okay. No, I'm still thinking about that. That's quite interesting.
Well, it's that kind of, we're collective social beings, and we share things in common, which just keep repeating themselves and happening throughout history. Yeah. And that there's these archetypal patterns of behaviour which we project onto certain individuals. So, for example, at the moment, we've got this. Putin is this strongman figure that he wants to project himself as, and a lot of the reporting in the West is, trying to undermine that strongman, self-created strongman figure. So you get this ludicrous image of the 24-foot long table. Yeah. Whereas when he meets with his allies, he's at a 4-foot table. When he meets with the leader of the people from the UN, he's on a 24-foot, or President Marcon, he's at a 24-foot. And the symbolism of that is kind of ham-fisted.
Yeah.
But it's driven by something which is, about status and power and the perception and how you can manage people's perceptions of you believing that they're powerful when in fact, is it like somebody bluffing at a card table that they're not? I mean, that's one of the... Sorry, you just triggers a thought. I'm rambling. I know I'm rambling. I've got a cold and the paracetamol have just kicked in and the caffeine. But it's interesting with the Bond films that a recurring motif in the Bond films is the card game. It's the poker game.
Yeah.
And trying to understand the enemy or the agent of the enemy in a game of bluff and how that works and operates and how Bond has this deep... I was watching Casino Royale with Le Chiffre, is that his name?
Yeah.
The French name guy. And he, the bluffing and the 20 minutes of the film is focused on this sequence, interspersed with acts of violence and things like that, but it's really just about, and the tension that it creates and the dynamics of the different players around the table and the way that they use masculinity and femininity on this stage, which is repeated in every 25 Bond films have repeated this scene, and you can't have a Bond film without that scene being in there.
Yeah, well, because I suppose ultimately the underlying point of that scene to play out, and especially in Casino Royale, is the idea that the enemy, this guy, he wants, like you say with Putin, he wants to project that figure of someone who's in power, someone who's in control. But ultimately, within the text of that film, he's a man that's spiralling out of control because he's lost everybody's money, he doesn't know what to do. This is a last-ditch effort to get it all back before he's killed by all of the gangsters that show up with machetes. And it's like that. James Bond is sat there and he's calling his bluff because he knows that ultimately he isn't a powerful man. And it re-establishes that figure of James Bond from the government as the strong figure, the real strong man who comes in to sort out the problem.
As you said earlier, the person who's prepared to throw away the rules and act on instinct. And that's the difference. So it's kind of, there's a couple of layers with it, isn't it? There's always a shadowy figure behind the shadowy figure. And in those 5 films that Daniel Craig was in, it's the sequence of finding out who the shadowy figure is behind the shadowy figure. Where the people that you don't know about, that's made explicit through the films.
Yeah.
And yet, it's resolved by somebody else that you don't know about. And it's like there's always constant regression back into something that you don't know about, But in actual fact, it's with the card game, you're looking at something that's in front of you. And there's, if you're looking in the shadows at that point, you're going to miss the points because it's the cards that are in your hand.
Yeah.
That you've got to play those cards. And that's a really interesting dynamic.
It also makes the idea of a game in these displays of power very explicit, because there are so many ways you could do that scene of the powerful figure and then the good guy coming in to expose that he wants you to think he's a powerful figure but he's not, so I'm going to kill him. But the fact that it takes place over a game of cards I find to be really significant, because it shows that there are rules that have to be abided by when you're playing this, even if you are the sort of rogue good guy figure who's going in, and that there are ways that these things work, and it just boils it all down to a game of cards.
It's really just a retelling of a Greek tragedy, isn't it? I don't know whether it's a comedy or a tragedy, I can never tell the difference, but it's like there's elements of comedy, but it's largely a tragedy. It's that fall from idealism, and it's that, that's what it is. Is that what it boils down to? Is it that kind of constant battle between the fates and the power that we have as individuals to resist those fates?
Yeah, and also the idea that ultimately in games of power like this, violence will inevitably play a major role, or the choice not to be violent. But the idea that at the end of the day, it means nothing unless you've got somebody like James Bond who's willing to show up and pull a trigger or snap somebody's neck with a toilet bowl.
And the sad truth is that brute force is widespread. That's what armies are for. That is how power is achieved. It isn't down to any one individual. It has to be industrialised. We've learnt that through the 20th century, that industrialisation, but it's always been there. And that actually, that I wonder if the embodiment in an individual is kind of a way of us evading that brutality that exists within our psyche. That brutality is there constantly, but what we do is we project it onto the notion of a heroic figure or a redeeming figure or an anti-hero figure, which Bond would be. Yeah,
as a way of sort of ultimately avoiding the guilt that comes along with the violence, to say, well, oh, look, there's this guy here, he's the... Yeah, I've got nothing to do with it, it's him.
It allows you to project it outwards rather than and distance yourself from it, rather than saying, actually, we're all capable of this level of brutality, or we're all complicit. We can be complicit with those who are more capable than ourselves of doing this, because we allow it to, we pay our taxes, we fund a particular kind of system, we're part of a society that asserts itself in this particular way and has international alliances based on these kind of perceived needs or actual needs, whereas the popular culture figure is like a kind of, it's somebody that we can look at on a screen, and we don't really have to look at ourselves in the process.
Yeah, and in a way that that puts a sheen on that violence, and maybe sometimes glamorizes it to the extent where it becomes acceptable. You're like, oh, well, look at this heroic figure. It no longer becomes something horrific. It becomes much more palatable in the hands of a figure like James Bond.
Yeah, and so you can stylise it.
Yeah,
John Wick and numerous other films. The Man with No Name. It's like the violence then becomes normalised, and it's part of the routine of what they do.
Yeah. And it's weird as well, because
whereas actual violence is exceptional. It's very rare. I know it seems common because we see it a lot of the time. Lots of murders and attacks are getting reported in our press, but proportionally, they're much less. We live in a much less violent society now than we have done in the past.
It's both exceptional and much more impactful in a way that is, people get killed a dime a dozen in films to the point where it no longer has any impact. But I remember having an experience where I think I was in my second year of university, and I got my jaw broken clean in half by a traveller, to the point where when I opened up my mouth, my teeth opened up like a bridge. But it was an exceptional experience in the way that all it took was a single punch, and none of it was glamorized, and there was blood everywhere, and the people around you that see it happen are sort of totally in shock, and it's a moment that defines what happens next for a very long time, in a way that when you see violence occur on films or when you hear it talked about, that is very rarely touched upon.
Yeah, the rehabilitation for people who've been injured is never followed up.
Yeah.
You get some film. I'm thinking of, if it's not questionable to mention Oliver Stone, but things like Born on the 4th of July, about the kind of the impact that that kind of industrial level of warfare violence had on American servicemen when they came back to after the Vietnam War. That kind of level of that kind of. There's probably lots of other films that do follow it up, but it's not as commercial. Yeah,
well, I remember seeing again another Oliver Stone film, Natural Born Killers, about those. I don't know if you've seen it, but the two murderers who sort of roam across, and the ending is particularly interesting, where they end up in prison, and there's a whole media circus around it. There's a kind of retrospective glamorization of what's occurred with these two ultimately really horrific, almost sickening figures, and Robert Downey Jr.'s character's obsession with descending further and further into this world, and then the ultimate. It causes him destruction. Ultimately, I think he gets killed at the end, doesn't he?
It's a question I've asked myself, and I'm sure many other people ask this all the time. Is that why do we engage with popular culture that is clearly self-destructive, miserable, nihilistic? I don't play games anymore because I'm not interested in uber violence, shooting thousands of people for the sake of it. For me, it's like Lego Star Wars. That'll do me. That's about my limit. It's the same with, I don't watch crime dramas on TV. I find them morose. I find them depressing. I don't watch soap operas because there's a kind of view of human nature which is very built in as being very negative. And yet, I don't know. Am I is the exception out there? It's like kind of is it something which? Why is that so prevalent as the kind of mode of escapism for so many people to play a lot when that should clearly be the exception?
I don't know. I suppose there's always a kind of fascination with the darker side of the human experience. Like, I remember, I'm sure I've talked before about how my parents are constantly watching like either Silent Witness or Call the Midwife or whatever, and in every episode, it's baked into the concept, somebody's dead or has been horrifically killed, and they need to find out why and how and go into the gory details of how and why it happened, or every other week a baby dies, and it's like, this is a bit grim for the sake of being grim, and you're not getting anything out of it. There's no like I always bring it back to the concept of the superhero, and it's one of the things I love about that mode of fiction is there's always this aspirational figure stood there. Like Superman is fantastic for that. No matter how dark things get, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. There's a figure there showing you, leading by example, how to break that cycle, how to improve things. He's known as the man of tomorrow, right? As in like what we could be and what we could do if only we'd break that cycle of violence.
Yeah, there's the transcendent symbol. This is again, why I'm fascinated with Jung's idea, which is why I'm tracing back some of the roots of what his thought originated from, which seems to be German romantic philosophy, Kant and Schelling and people like that, and it's this idea that the transformative potential comes through not in the dialectic of the competition of opposites and the synthesis of opposites, but in the tension of the opposites and the transcendent. And I'm kind of, it's getting me thinking about what that transcendent, and it comes through in our symbols. What are those transcendent symbols? And I think looking at our popular cultures, people like Bond, Superman, these iconic symbols, particularly masculine symbols, and there are feminine symbols out there, but they're just not as prevalent within our society, which tells us something about the kind of society we are. Maybe we need to shift to a more feminine role, and to understand programs like Call the Midwife, for example, which is largely a feminine model of care, which is different from defending. So those archetypal figures of the carer versus the defender, or the sentinel versus the caregiver, are kind of quite deeply rooted, and in popular culture terms, some are more valued than others. So the defender is placed more highly above the caregiver, whereas what is actually essential is to hold them in balance. But is there a transcendent symbol that would, the point is not to try and reconcile them, but Jung talks about holding the tension of the opposites, is because that's how the transcendent emerges. So that it would be interesting to reconsider how the next generation of superhero fantasy comic figures emerge and come through as a kind of a hybrid figure who is both caring and defending. Would that be something that would be is there any evidence of those kind of things happening? Is there anybody out there doing stuff which generates that kind of interest?
I mean, for one, I think Grant Morrison has always been a very interesting figure within superhero literature. And even his non-superhero literature, I'm thinking of the Invisibles, touches on a lot of these things. And there's a cast of characters made up of, men, women, like a transsexual figure as well, and that difference between the masculine and the feminine, and when one is necessary and when the other's necessary. And I mean, his very famous Superman comic ultimately ends with him sacrificing himself because his time is over. It's time for something else, a new figure, a new symbol to fill that void where Superman is no longer necessary.
Yeah. Might be interesting to look at some of those things, those kind of series. I'm thinking of things like the Eternals, which I've seen briefly on.
Yes, that's very interesting as well. Yeah, these, because especially seeing as the within the text of the film, they've been about for the whole of history, and it's very much I'm thinking of the main male character. I can't remember his name. Is he played by Richard Madden? But anyway, he's like the warrior, again, the protector, that violent figure that does what is necessary for the good of mankind. And then you've also got the more feminine figure played by Selma Hayek, who's like the mother, the carer, who's not so much interested in that violence, but taking a more of a caregiver position to make sure that the protector isn't needed in the first place.
Yeah, and the balance between the two.
Yeah.
So, anything on your radar for this week?
No, nothing in particular. Nothing comes to mind. I tell you what, we'll see when we do another one of these. Maybe I'll watch the Fantastic Beast movies now that you've brought them to my attention.
Yeah, just make a note of. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, the same stories are played out all over the place, aren't they? So it's watch something else. Keep an eye on. We're starting to develop a sense of what to keep an eye on as it feeds through. Kind of popular culture, particularly emergent popular culture, those things which are I've actually, in our conversation, I've kind of revised my opinion of the current crop of Doctor Who with Jodie Whittaker as a kind of, actually, maybe this is a little bit more interesting than I kind of first, it didn't feel as if it fitted with my expectations of what that archetypal figure is about.
Yeah.
Is that shifted? Is the ground moving in some way? And that's the interesting bit to try and follow through.
I told a lie. I'll tell you what is on my radar that I'm currently engaging with, and is Moon Knight, the show on Disney Plus, and that idea of the sort of I guess Batman figure as an ultimately damaged archetype, a schizophrenic character who's ultimately causing a lot more harm than good, I think is very interesting. And
very, very tied in with symbolism.
Yeah.
Very tied in with that kind of deep archetypal symbolism. Okay, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Twitter @Clayton Comics
with
an X
at the end. And if you want to get in contact with me, I'm Rob Watson, and it's @RobWMedia. If you want to leave a donation, sign up on Patreon. You can do that if you go to the website. It's robwatsonmedia.net. But until next time, thanks very much. You've been listening to Distraction Therapy with me, Rob Watson. Find out more at robwatsonmedia.net, or follow me on Instagram and Twitter @RobWMedia.